Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure you never miss an interview by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And of course, be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our humanitarian and advocacy efforts across the globe. When art historian Dr. David Landau first visited Venice's extraordinary Renaissance synagogues 12 years ago, he couldn't believe what he saw. These once magnificent buildings were in disrepair, falling apart from neglect and lack of resources. As he told Smithsonian Magazine earlier this year, the temples, quote, needed to be kind of cared for and loved, both for the local Jewish community and for tourists in Europe's first ghetto. And that's exactly what he worked to do. For the past 3 years, Dr. Landau has led fundraising efforts to preserve 3 of Venice's historic synagogues, all located in the city's 500-year-old Jewish ghetto. And so far, he's raised almost half of the $11 million needed to restore the buildings to their former glory, places that serve as beautiful reminders of the rich Jewish history of Italy. Today, Dr. Landau joins me to talk about his work helping to restore the Synagogues of Venice, as well as Jewish involvement in glassmaking through the pivotal importance of Jewish people to that craft in Europe throughout the centuries. Dr. David Landau is an art historian, philanthropist, and medical doctor who has led the effort to save the historic Synagogues of Venice, as well as its glassmaking traditions. David, great to have you with us today.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, before we delve into the project for the restoration of Renaissance Synagogues of Venice, let's talk about your own history. You're a scholar of 16th century Italian art, connoisseur and specialist in modern glass by the Venini Studio, graphic expert, fundraiser, publisher, philanthropist, and physician. Where did you grow up and how did you embark on so many paths, and one that led you, among other things, to the study and appreciation of Italian fine and decorative arts?
Well, my story is a bit complicated. It's the story of many Jews. I was born in Israel, and at the age of almost 5, when my parents divorced, I left Israel and I went to Venice. But I didn't go to Venice because I was meant to stay there. I went to Venice because it was an obligatory crossing point to go to Trieste, where my mother's family, part of my mother's family, had survived the war. And but in Venice, I can't remember. I went with a boat from Haifa called Messapia, and but I can't remember anything about Venice itself except the train station, because in Israel there were no trains. And for the first time, I saw a train, a steam train, and I loved it. So that was my encounter with Italy. And then I grew up in Trieste till the age of 11, then in Milan, then I went to university in Pavia and got my medical degree. And then I had a kind of conversion at about 28. And for a long history, this is not worth recounting here, I moved to England and I changed entirely my life and became an art historian at Oxford. And I stayed in Oxford for 30 years. But I was itching for new things all the time. And while teaching and while working on exhibitions like the Genius Venice exhibition, the Royal Academy in London, and the Mantegna exhibition, also the Royal Academy and the Metropolitan Museum, and writing books and so on in art history, I also started doing business. I started first an ice cream business, delicious ice cream business. A bit too early in the curve. I was producing totally organic ice cream in the 80s when it was unheard of. And it didn't work out because for 2 consecutive summers, it rained all summer, something that we can't even imagine this year. And then I started a kind of newspaper for classified advertising, where the ads were free to private advertisers, and that was a great success. And we went from 7 employees to 1,200 in 15 years. and I sold it very well at the top of the dot-com boom. And so on that, I could just, as it were, retire and devote myself to other things. And so I did. I continued both in art history. I had funded a journal on the history of printmaking, Print Quarterly, which is still the leading journal series, scholarly journal about printmaking, the history of printmaking. And I edited that for the first 27 years. It's now almost 40. And I produced other exhibitions, but same time, I opened a venture capital company with the money I had made, and investing in, again, early stage technologies that are now very much at the fore of people's mind in the environment and so on. And then I devoted a lot of time to the things I liked. I was involved in many museums, the Courtauld Institute, the Warburg Institute, the National Gallery, and I was a trustee of the National Gallery and the chairman of the gallery company, National Gallery Company, that runs all the business of the National Gallery, the restaurants, the publishing house, and so on. And then 12 years ago, as you said, my wife and I decided we had to move out of London for several reasons. And as we had three kind of children, almost grown-up children, and two who were children of my wife, and twins that we had produced ourselves, who were at the time 5, we were looking for a place where to live. We tried very hard to go and live in Paris. We couldn't find any place we liked. And so as I had bought a house in Venice, for holiday house in Venice, I said, well, my wife said, let's go to Venice for the time being. And once you go to Venice, you fall in love with Venice. There's no way you get out. And in fact, we have been there for all these years. And obviously, as Jews, we went to the community and slowly got involved. And the children had bar mitzvah in the community, and so we became involved.
It's really a very interesting odyssey. As we speak, the heat index in Washington today will be about 100 degrees. So the organic ice cream actually is the part of your story that appeals very much.
I wish I had it still.
As we're sitting here today. But now let's talk about your project involving the restoration of 3 synagogues located in the Venetian Ghetto. As I noted in my introduction, you moved, and as you said, you moved to Venice 12 years ago. What are these 3 synagogues, and what drew you to these centuries-old temples? Had you heard about them before moving there, or since then? What's driven your commitment to these particular places?
Well, they have 2 characteristics that are very close to my heart. First, they are 16th century. They are Renaissance. They were made in the Renaissance, which is the period which I study and I have written about, and it's the heart of my life. And so, I think I've been to possibly every single open church in Venice as an art historian, particularly the Renaissance ones, but all of them really. And I was very curious about the synagogues, because the one thing that you haven't mentioned is these 3 ones that I'm now working on are the earliest synagogues in Venice. So they were all built in the 16th century. And we'll come back to that in a second. The second reason is that I'm a Jew. and so the ghetto is part of my blood, whether I like it or not, it's part of my blood. And the combination of a beautiful monument and the fact that this was built by Jews 500 years ago or more, it's irresistible. It was irresistible to me. And when I visited the first, I don't want people to have an idea that these synagogues were totally abandoned. They were totally abandoned. But the community doesn't have the means to restore them as they should be. And therefore they were maybe loved by the small community in Venice. We are about 450 people. They were loved but not cared for, because simply a community doesn't have the financial wherewithal to care for them. And so the 3 synagogues are the first one is the German synagogue. It's called Schola Tedesca. That was built by a group of refugees from northern Germany in 1528. 4 years later only, 1532, a group of other Ashkenazi Jews came from possibly Alsace. And because the synagogue, which is called Schola Canton, has also been called the French synagogue. And it's possible that this group of refugees came from Alsace, so in between French and German territories. And then the third one is slightly later, is about 1570, and was built by a group of refugees coming from a persecution in southern Italy. And so it's called Scuola Italiana, the Italian synagogue. And they are increasingly large, as it were, as you go over time. And that the size of the synagogue depended on the size of the refugee population. And what was happening was that every time a new group of refugees would arrive in Venice, they would be given a space. And if a space was available, obviously, they would be given a space and told, build your place here. This is build your house here. And obviously they built their house, and on top of their house, they built a synagogue, because all of these groups of people had different rituals, different languages, different way of being Jews. And so they didn't want to go to a place where they would pray in a different way. They would speak in Italian, say, in Venetian, rather than in German or French or whatever. They wanted to have their own way of being Jewish. And so they built their houses. And their houses in the ghetto are special in Venice because they are long and narrow. And the floors, the distance between floors is very small. I mean, the height of the ceiling for instance, in the building of the German synagogue is 1.75 meters, which means that I, for instance, I'm not particularly tall, but I am above 175. I have to crouch. I have to bend my head, which is always a good thing in any case. But I had to bend my head in order not to hit my forehead. And what happened was that they had to fit as many people as possible in the space available. And so they would build floors, one on top of another, with low ceilings, and each family was given a kind of small space with very thin walls at the sides, and they had to live there. And, Jews often produce very large families, and however many children they had to fit them in the space available. And there was 2 rooms, as it were, that were good, one at each end of the building, one on the canal side and one on the square side. But in the middle, people were squished between each other, and it must have been terribly cold in winter, terribly hot in summer, and very smelly throughout. And so it must have been very, very upsetting to be there, even if you were in a place where people would not kill you, which was a big advantage of being in Venice. And then, so the one salvation, as it were, from this terrible situation was to go up. And on top of all the floors, there was a synagogue on 2 floors with big windows looking onto the square and looking onto the canal, and air, space, light. So it made people very religious, I think, because they was the only place where they could live like human beings. And this happened in all these buildings that we are talking about. The German synagogue is fairly small. The canton, the so-called French synagogue, is more or less the same size, which means that the 2 groups of refugees were more or less the same, whereas the Italian synagogue is quite a lot larger. It's probably more than twice the size of the other 2. And that means that the group of refugees that had come from southern Italy was much bigger. And but they are very different from one another because they kind of maintain the original character of the 3 populations. Although over the century they were restored, particularly in the 18th century, in the late 17th century, where Jews were wealthy and they were doing very well, even if crammed into the ghetto because they couldn't get out at night and they had all to come back from whatever they were doing to spend the night in the ghetto. They were locked in, physically locked in, like in a prison. but they were doing well. They were famous lawyers, famous doctors, great juridical minds, and they were teachers. They were tutors to most of the aristocracy in Venice, and they were even, and that amazed me when I read the documents, the great rabbis of Venice had to be great dancing masters, because part of teaching the kids of the aristocracy was not only Latin and math and geography, but was also dance. They had to teach them how to dance. And so I can't imagine, there are some great rebbe that came from the Jewish ghetto, particularly in the 16th, 17th centuries. And I can't imagine them dancing the dances that then the aristocrats would dance. So it was, and coming back to the ghetto, I mean, they were visiting these palazzi, marvelous palazzi of the aristocracy, and then we're coming back to a very modest living. And, there were chickens and ducks everywhere. There were obviously no paving in the ghetto, in the Campo de Ghetto Nuovo, in the square. It was a very kind of basic life. But outside, and some of them were enormously wealthy. So much that when there was war, problems, and so on, the Doge would call the head of the Jews and tell him, "I need money. I need a loan. I need 10,000 ducats. I need 20,000 ducats for the army." And the Jews could never say no, whatever were they being asked.
Well, let's talk about the creation of the ghetto itself. And as you've really described it quite well, in terms of the narrow buildings, all of Venice is like that. Venice is very closely packed. And the ghetto itself is kind of a microcosm of a closely packed area. So it really is very, very confined. But tell us about the creation of the ghetto itself.
Well, the ghetto was created in March 1516, and it was the result, obviously, of anti-Semitism, fundamentally. Jews had arrived in large groups, in enormous number in Venice after 1492, after they had been chased out of first Spain and then Portugal. And a large number of Jews obviously moved eastwards. And many arrived in Italy, and particularly in Venice, which was the most important commercial center in Europe at the time. And they were not allowed to settle in Venice. They were never allowed to live in Venice, but they lived in Mestre, which is on the terraferma, on the continent, as it were. And it was Venice at the time was an island. Now it's connected with the bridge. But it was an island, and they lived on the earthy end of Venice, and so they were about a mile from the city, and they were allowed to stay during the day in the city, as long as they wore a yellow cap, very visible yellow cap, and a very visible yellow scarf, so that anybody in the city would see them from far away coming towards them. They knew they were Jews, and which was obviously a sign of great friendship, as we know from history. But they were not allowed ever to sleep in Venice, to have a house or anything in Venice. And then in 1516, Venice had been beaten very badly in 1509 in the Battle of Agnadello by the forces together of the Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, the French King, and the Pope. So they were in a very dire situation, and they needed the help of the Jews, because the Jews did some important roles in Venice and in many other places. They were bankers, in the sense that they had contacts all over Europe, and they could raise very large amounts of money if they needed to. And so they could give very large loans, as I said before, that nobody else could, particularly at times of crisis, like after losing a war. Second, they had pawn shops, and the poor of Venice really relied on the pawn shops. When times were bad, say there had been a very bad harvest, and the price of wheat was very high, even to buy some bread, the poor had to pawn their wedding ring or something. And the only people who could do it were the Jews, because it was forbidden for Christians to be running a pawn shop. And the Jews were allowed to do it, obviously, because there was no religious restriction for that. But obviously at a rate that wasn't very convenient to them, which was 5%, with which they could hardly break even. But anyway, they had to do it because it was imposed on them. And this third reason, which became increasingly important in the following period, was that the Jews could travel around and nobody would bother them, in the sense that particularly, Venice was at war with the Ottoman Empire all the time, and for control of the Mediterranean. And it was good times and bad times, but mostly bad times. For instance, in 1499, Venice was beaten in a place called Zonkyo in the Mediterranean very badly by the Turkish fleet. And they had to, and was a tremendous loss for the city. So Jews were the only people who were very respected by the Ottomans. They always had a high, they were thought very highly by the Ottoman Sultan. And so they could go around to the whole of Mediterranean. They could go to Syria, Egypt, even places where they can't go now, Syria, Lebanon, and obviously Constantinople and all the Ottoman territories without being bothered by anybody. And so this was very important because, Venice lived on Mediterranean commerce. The most important source of revenue for Venice was the commerce of objects coming from the east through water, and therefore, which would then Venice would export to the northern country, to Germany, to Flanders, and to the rest of Italy. So it was crucial for them to have a line of communication with the rest of the Mediterranean, and Jews performed this function very, very beautiful. And that's why Venice needed them, and that's why in 1516, although they were, I read the speeches of some of the senators who decided to set up or convince the Council of Ten to set up the ghetto. They said, we need the Jews. We can't do without them, but we don't want to have them around. We don't want our women. They were particularly concerned about women falling in love with Jews. I don't know why, but they were. They really were. And in every speech, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, every time there is a speech against the Jews, they say our women are at risk, our virgin daughters are at risk from Jews. And so they said, well, why don't we keep them here? We give them a refuge where to go because they're being persecuted all over Europe. Let's give them a place where to live. Let's put them in an island that we can lock down, as it were, we can control. Let's put it in an island which has only a maximum 2 exits, 2 bridges to the rest of Venice, and let's confine them there. Let's build gates for this to enter these 2 bridges, and let's put Christian guards at the gates. And so they chose an island was called Ghetto. Ghetto means to throw bronze, because that is where the foundries of Venice to make cannons were. And because it's an island with large canals around it, and therefore it's safe in case of fire, because when you obviously you have a foundry, fire is a great risk. And that was an island was well protected from fire. And so it was called Ghetto. And then when the Germans arrived, they couldn't pronounce the word Ghetto because they didn't know the soft G, and they called it they read it Ghetto. And that's where the word was started. But it was locked at night. The Jews had to pay the Christian guards very high salaries. The Jews has to pay the owners of the existing buildings in this Ghetto island were very much against, obviously, having these Jews as to rent their apartments, or the space, and so they complained bitterly, and therefore the Signoria decided very with great equanimity that the owners of the buildings had some rights after all, and that therefore the Jews had to pay 33% more than the current rents. And the Jews had to pay 33% more than the current rents. They had to pay the guards. They had to pay every year. They had to pay what was called a condotta, which was a fixed amount of money given to the city, which was in between 5,000 and 10,000 gold ducats, which was an enormous sum of money. And but they had to find it. There was no way out. And every 4 years there was 6 months of negotiation for the next 4 years. And and it depended whether Venice was in good shape, in bad shape. They needed the Jews. They didn't need the Jews. They hated the Jews. They didn't hate the Jews more than necessary. And then it was 5,000, 7,000, 10,000, but never been less than 5. But it was a very costly affair to be there. But it was the only place in Europe where Jews could be working and not had the guarantee of not being killed, at least for 4 years.
Well, let's go back, if we can, to the synagogues. Can you discern any common elements between Italian Renaissance fine and decorative arts and the iconography or design of the synagogue interiors? I know that one of these houses of worship features a display of paintings, for example. Which one houses them, and is that unusual? And what is their narrative?
Well, remember that the people who actually built inside of the synagogues were local craftsmen, because the Jews were not craftsmen. They were scholars, they were thinkers, they were doctors, they were businessmen, but they were not craftsmen. Jews were not craftsmen. So they used local craftsmen, and local craftsmen were used to making churches, not synagogues. And so obviously the rabbi or whoever told them, no, you can't put images here. So forget about images, but you can put curlicues, you can put spirals, you could put the Star of David, you can put this and that, but you can put ornamental decoration, but you obviously can't put any images of man. And that worked in the German synagogue. There are no such images. In the Canton synagogue, there weren't probably originally, but when it was restored in the 18th century, in the early 18th century, and now it looks tremendously beautiful, all gilded and beautiful. And they're not paintings, but they are panels of sculpted panels, which have images. They have one arm that appears with a sword, which is the arm of Abraham, but Isaac is not there, and there is the altar, as it were, where Isaac was meant to be sacrificed, but there is an arm with a sword, and there is manna falling down, and there is all kind of. There is a flood, and there is all kind of images that obviously taken from the Bible, but no actual representation of man. And in Italian synagogue, there is no representation of man, but there are very beautiful inscriptions that are, in fact, 8th, 19th century copies of 16th century's leather, engraved leather, and we found, actually, I was going around some communities areas with the current president of the community, and we looked down above in the room above the oven where they make the Pesach, the matzot, and I said, what is in that box? And we opened it, and there were all the original leather inscriptions, which we will now restore and put back in place. But it's a great, very satisfactory job. I mean, in the Italian synagogue, we had it had a horrible floor that was put in the 1970s, and it was really, I called it a pizzeria floor, because it was in terrazzo, Venetian terrazzo floor, but it was made in cement, and it looked absolutely atrocious. And it was made in sections, so it really looked like a pizzeria floor. But it was quite high and unusually high, and it was a big step to get onto it. And I thought maybe, what happened in 1970s, instead of substituting that one for the one on the old one, they maybe put it on top of the old one, and because they didn't have enough money to restore the old one. And so we took the risk and we broke some sections of it. And sure enough, we found the floor, and underneath now, there is about 90%, 99 to 95% of the floor is the original floor. And we are restoring it. It's going to be spectacularly beautiful.
So really, beyond your role as a fundraiser for this initiative, you really are consulting and lending your extensive knowledge of art to the renovation process and helping the restorers. How is the project progressing? And can visitors tour the renovated spaces or not yet?
Not yet. It's a building site. We went in big time. It's not visitable except by appointment with me. If you are willing to participate in my effort, you are welcome to come, and I'll show you around. But it's not visitable because it's a hard situation. There's scaffolding everywhere. There's obstacles and wires and tubes and pipes and cement and everything everywhere. But we are getting better and better. I should correct you about what you said before, less than half. We've raised now 3/4 of the amount that we need, which is fantastic. In the last 4 months, we raised, obviously the prices, as we talk, the price of raw material goes up all the time. Unfortunately, as you know, because of Ukraine and inflation, the prices have gone up for raw materials enormously. So that has added another 2 million to my project, unfortunately. But I've been very lucky. In the last 4 months, I raised $4 million from Jewish Foundation worldwide. And last week, we got the terrific news that the Italian Minister of Culture has allotted 1.6 million euros to the project. And so we are now about short of about 2.5 million. And I see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I hope it's not the train coming my way.
I hope not. It sounds like you're doing well. But those who are contributing it sounds like this is coming from an international group of donors, correct?
And very much so. I mean, the great prominence is that of the American donors. The largest donor has been Ronald Lauder, who has been the angel of this project. He was the first to say to me, okay, I'll give you, he gave me $2 million straight away. And he was, throughout it, was extremely generous with his time, introduced me to a lot of people. He spoke to a lot of prime ministers. He spoke to the President of Italy, Prime Minister of Italy, Minister of Culture of Italy, and he's been a tremendous supporter. And then Shelby White has been an enormous supporter as well, with Jerome and the Olivi Foundations. And then Wendy Fisher has been a fantastic, with the Kirsch Foundation, has been a fantastic supporter. So we have had, and then great support from Save Venice. They have been terrific. They have taken charge completely of the Italian synagogue, and they are spending more than they thought, because, for instance, it is there that we found the original floor, and that will cost a lot of money to restore. But they've been really fantastic supporters, and the World Monuments Fund has been very, very helpful. So we've had and I shouldn't, for God's sake, omit the Rothschild family, both in England, the Rothschild family in England, the Rothschild charity in Israel, the Rothschild family in France and in Switzerland. They've all been tremendously generous to me. And Lord Rothschild was the second donor that I found. Also, I must admit, I've been a trustee of their foundation for a very long time.
Well, I shouldn't say I'm surprised, because I think that Venice is one of those iconic Jewish communities that, even if your own roots are not from there, my particular case, my particular age. My father was from Tsarist Russia. My mother was from Lithuania. But all of us feel that connection to Venice. It's just an iconic Jewish place in history. And I think that's what comes through to me as you go through this list of donors. Just one more question before we get to glassmaking, because I want to talk about that for a moment. So with 3 different projects going on, what do you see as the completion date for this project?
Well, the completion date is somewhat related to the amount of money that I can raise, because I made an agreement at the very outset with the community, and I'm the sole fundraiser, that the project was divided in phases, and no phase could start until all the money for that particular phase was in the kitty. So that will depend, the completion date will depend on that. But I would have thought, with the money raised in the last few months, that now after the holidays, now in September, we will start in earnest on a large scale, because we will have quite a lot of money in the kitty. And so if I manage to find the last bid, the last, say, $2.5 million, within 18 months, I think we can finish the whole project.
Well, now let's talk a bit about glassmaking. What has driven your love for glassmaking?
Well, my love for glassmaking comes from my love for my wife, in the sense that when I married her, she had a small but very choice collection of Venetian glass made by the Venini factory. The Veninis were the most advanced and daring glassmakers in the 20th century in Venice. They were at the forefront they were the avant-garde of glassmaking, and they were the most successful factory in Murano. And so when I married her, or when I met her, I started looking at a collection of glass. I didn't know anything about it. As an art historian, I was bound to put my nose into it and try to understand more. And so I did, and I learned as much as I could. I read books, and then I started buying her presents. And in order to buy her presents, I need to know what I was buying. And so, and she had maybe 30 or 40 pieces. And then I started buying them, and now we have about 2,500. And I think we have the largest collection of Venini glass in the world. And so when we moved to Venice, we moved with all this massive amount of glass, and we thought that we would find in Venice a place full of exhibitions about glass, big libraries about glass, everything about glass, because Venice has been tied to glass for 1,000 years. And we didn't, and there was nothing happening. And the Museum of Glass in Murano was practically dead, and was just opened on a day. I mean, it's a beautiful museum, but nothing. They had no particular activities to note, and there were no publications, no exhibitions, and so on. So we started first. We offered our collection to the museum as a present. They turned it down because they say, we have got the people, we have got the space, and so on. And then somebody from the Fondazione Cini, Pasquale Gagliardi, the then Secretary General, heard about this and said, well, come to the island, I'll show you, we have some space here. And so we went to the island, we saw this amazing space. He showed us an ex-school that had been abandoned about 10 years ago, a school for nautical studies, where the taxi drivers learned how to drive a taxi in Venice, for instance. And so we saw this beautiful space, and he said, put your collection here. And we said, no, we don't want to become competitors to the Glass Museum Murano, but we could have a Kunsthalle for glass. And so show our glass, or show glass generally, have exhibitions of glass in this place. So we called Annabel Seldorf, great architect who now is doing the Frick and the National Gallery in London and dozens of other museums in the world. But at that time she came, we happened to know her, and she came and enthusiastically made this space into a magnificent exhibiting space for glass. And we started doing exhibition 2 a year, one devoted to one chapter of the history of Venini, and one devoted to other forms of glass, either Finnish glass, Austrian glass, French glass, glass as used by contemporary sculptors, American studio glass, anything, you name it, we had exhibitions. We have had so far 19 exhibitions. The 20th is opening on the 17th of September. But altogether, because our exhibition have traveled around the world, we've had 39 exhibitions, and we've had so far 1.5 million visitors to our exhibitions. And that means that probably most of these visitors had never seen a piece of glass in their life before, and certainly not in an exhibition, not in a museum context. And so I think we have achieved something. And we are doing all that because we want to help Murano to revive. Because Murano, like Jewish community, is in a weak position. And like in the ghetto, the revival of the role of the synagogues. Remember that the synagogues are the only synagogues in the world that have been used by Jews for 500 years in a row, except obviously 40 to 45. These three synagogues have been used year in, year out for 500 years. And Murano has been used to make glass for 1,000 years. And but both of them were kind of petering out. And we hope that through our work, through the foundation that we have set up called Pentagram Stiftung, we have helped to interest people in glass again, and to interest Muranese people to experiment in new ways. Because in all our exhibition, all the Muranese families, they all come to see them, and they comment on them. I obviously I'm very often there, and I stand in a corner and I hear Muranese, great maestri of glassmaking, talking to other maestri or to their wives about how did he make that object, and we're talking about Finnish glass made in 1936. How did he make that? And I think he made it this way, that way. I'll try that. I'll try to see whether it works. And the other thing we are trying to do is to interest glassmakers in assisting sculptors and artists to make objects, works of art in glass, rather than marble, bronze, wood, or whatever, to make them in glass. And that is a new opening. There has been a gentleman in Murano called Berengo who has started doing this about, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, and doing it very well. And we would like this to be extended to many more Muranese furnaces, because, making glass, a drinking glass, identical to the previous one for generations, is not paying off anymore, because the Chinese can do that for a fraction of the cost that it would be in Murano. So literally maybe a 50th. So there's no point of trying to beat the Chinese at their game. And so we are trying to push them in an artistic direction, going towards quality rather than quantity. And it's happening.
And you call your space in the former nautical school, you call it the glass room, correct?
Yeah, the stanza del vetro, the rooms for glass. Yeah.
One final question before we close. Were Jews involved in glassmaking in Murano at all?
No, I don't think so. The Jews were not allowed to do anything in Venice until Napoleon came to Venice in 1797. Jews were literally not allowed to make anything. They were not allowed to have property. They were not allowed to construct anything. And so Jews, as far as I know, never made glass. Obviously, in the 19th century, when Jews were freed from the ghetto and they started roaming around, they could go and live anywhere in Venice, they started decorating glass. And so there are glass, 19th century glass decorated with Jewish motifs, with Magen David, with all kinds of Jewish patterns. But glassmaking has not been a Jewish occupation. Also because, they might have been very good at it, but they were not allowed. As they were not allowed to paint, they were not allowed to sculpt, they were not allowed to do anything that would compete with any of the locals.
Well, David Landau's leadership and efforts have been noted by the New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, Haaretz, ABC News, the Times of Israel, and so many others. David, we're looking forward to seeing the three synagogues completely restored and having all of your team's hard work and dedication pay off. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
Many thanks again to Dr. David Landau for giving us an up-close view of his efforts to restore Venice's historic synagogues and the community's glassmaking traditions. And thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this interview, make sure you catch all of our programs by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel or liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work, including our efforts supporting Ukrainian refugees as well as those within Ukraine's borders. For my guest, Dr. David Landau, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Join us again soon.